Thanks, Dan. Good to be with you guys. If I haven't met you yet, my name is John, and as Dan said, today is Project Just Start Sunday. It is a day I've been looking forward to for months and months. And so if you are brand new with us, you picked a great week for you to come to, in many ways, experience the heartbeat of our church. So since we started this thing when there was like 20 of us, part of this 8 years ago, we just said from the very beginning, we're going to love this community. We're going to have a heart that is for the 10 towns right here around us. So welcome to week 5 of Fight. Today what we're going to be talking about is how do we fight for our city? How do we fight for our city? And to be a little more specific, city can mean a lot of different things. We certainly want to fight for every city, but we definitely want to fight for our city, and we call our city the 10. And if you're brand new with us, you're wondering what the 10 is. It's not the Big 10, that's a conference. It's not that, but it is the 10 towns right around us. So out in the lobby, because there's been so many questions over the past 4 months, we decided to put a little map up so you can see the 10 towns right around us. And since the very beginning, we've said, man, we are going to radically invest and love and serve these 10 communities. And so we're today talking about how do we fight for the 10? How do we fight for our city? It would have been easy to end this teaching series that we've been calling Fight. It would have been easy to end it last week. How many of you were with us for Mother's Day last week? A ton of us. And Jackie Glass did a fantastic job teaching. If you weren't with us, make sure that you catch that online. It was so good. And so over the past 4 weeks, here's what we've talked about. We've talked about my peace, not like mine isn't mine, but yours as well. Okay, so but my peace, my kids, my marriage, and last week, myself. But here's the problem. Here's the problem. My and me is not the end of Christianity. My and me is not the end of Christianity. You love when I put together little slogans that rhyme, and so I've worked all week on this one slogan, okay? So I want us to say this together. Here we go, let's say it together. My and is not the end of, there it is right there. You don't even have to go to seminary, okay? Here it is for you, all right? Save some money. I talked to my daughters this morning. I said, Hannah, here's the deal, okay? My and me is not the end of Christianity. My and me, and that's really been over the past 4 weeks, is a really good place to start. It's just not a good place to finish. The last 4 weeks have been super important. You need to do a lot of work, and so do I, all of us, on the my, on the me, whether it's your peace and your marriage and your kids or your identity. But my and me is not the end of Christianity. This is why our logo of Christianity is a cross and not a mirror. All right, none of you have hanging around your neck a mirror, okay? It's because that's not the logo of our faith. The logo of our faith is a cross, and that tells us a whole lot of really, really important things. The faith Jesus lived out and modeled was not an inward-focused, inward-facing kind of faith. On the contrary, it was an outward-facing, outward-moving kind of faith. Why? This is because love works that way. Love is the kind of thing that is never self-contained. It never terminates on itself. It's not a retention pond. It's more of a river. And so love is always moving out to touch more, to bless more. It is always on the move. It is always moving out. And so certainly love personified when he walked the planet, Jesus Christ, he modeled this to perfection. In many ways, you could say the summit of his ministry, it certainly wasn't his baptism, but it was the cross and it was the resurrection. This is so important for us to understand. On your way in today, you saw in big black letters the 3 values of our church. It said gather, grow. The third one didn't say gather again. Did you notice this? It says gather, grow, and then what? It says, let's try that, guys. I mean, it's late, okay? I've already had a pot of coffee. Don't leave me up here. It says gather, grow, and yeah, it doesn't mean I don't want you to come back next week. I do. But it just means that outside of these walls is where it's at. It means that we're going to gather here and we're going to grow here so that you can go there. It just means that God's plan A to redeem and restore the world is for not you to attend more church services. It's so that you will literally infect and bless and serve the world that is right around us. Gather, grow, and go. Why? Well, my and me is not the end of Christianity. Rick Warren, he's a pastor of a really small church out west called Saddleback. He wrote a book only 8 billion people bought called The Purpose-Driven Life. Maybe you've read it. He said this one statement that I heard years ago that stuck with me. He said, how you see your life shapes your life. How you see your life shapes your life. How you see your life shapes your life. And I found an image online with how I think many of us can oftentimes see ourselves. And here it is. I don't think every morning I'm here, I'm flexing in the mirror. No, I'm not doing that. But I think that we can see within our lives and even within the church, humanism has moved in many ways to help us think that maybe we're the center of it all, right? To maybe trick us into thinking that we are the end all be all. And we can get in front of the mirror and we can flex and we can think that we are awesome. And it doesn't mean that you're not good, or it doesn't mean that you're not worth something. All right, we'll get to that in a minute. But how you see your life shapes your life. And if this is how you see your life, I just promise you that kind of life will terminate on itself. Instead, I think there's a better way for you to see your life, and it's this. It's that, no, you are salt. You are salt. You are salt. The title of my sermon today is for you to be the salt of the city. The salt of the city. I brought with me my favorite thing that I put on almost everything, including watermelon, and this is salt. So anyone else put salt on their watermelon? Yeah, it's unbelievable. My family thinks I'm crazy. But here's the thing, Jesus, when he was teaching in the Gospel of Matthew, he helped us out. He gave us these words that helps us understand how we need to see ourselves, how we need to see our lives. This is what Jesus says in Matthew 5:13, and this is going to frame up what we're going to talk about today when it comes to fighting for our city. Jesus looked at them and he said, "You are the salt of the earth." He said, say it with me, you are the salt of the earth. You're the salt of the earth. My hope and my prayer is that the power of the Holy Spirit would be moving today. Our team is in the boiler room, they're praying. Not that you would just experience a show, much more than that the power of God would do something in your life. Specifically, my prayer today is that in some ways we could move away from being the selfie generation to become the salty generation. That we would become the salt of the earth. When Jesus said these words, it was within the Sermon on the Mount, the most famous sermon ever given. In chapter 5, he looked at these followers, and they were up there on the hillside, and he looked at them, and he says, I know you're going to wonder who you are, so I want to just beat you to it. I want to make sure that you understand this. This is really important. And of all the things Jesus could have used as a metaphor, he chose to use salt. And so he looked at them, and he said, you are the salt of the earth. And what I want to talk about for a few minutes is, what did those first century ears hear when they heard the word salt? What came to their mind? Because I'm telling you, French fries did not come to their mind. So what came to the mind of that first century hearer all the way back in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13? So 4 things specifically that came to their minds that day on the hillside when Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. The first is value. The first is value. When Jesus looked at them and he said, listen, you are the salt, okay? You're the salt of the earth. Immediately they thought value. Why? The Jews at this time, they were a conquered people. They were oppressed by the Romans. In the first century, they were under the Roman thumb. And in the Roman Empire, salt was of so much value. In fact, I find it interesting that Roman soldiers were often paid in salt. All right, some of you own businesses, and right now, this is your takeaway. Payroll next week, you're just going to give out salt, all right? But that's what they would do back in the day. They would pay Roman soldiers in salt. Why salt was of so much value? They used it in everything. In fact, if a soldier did not do a good job, they would say that he was not worth his salt. Some of you have wondered, where does that saying come from? This is where it comes from. Why? Because salt was of so much value. Those that were listening to this sermon that Jesus gave were mostly poor people. And when they heard these words, it was almost like impossible to believe. Is Jesus really saying that we are of great value? The answer is yes. You are of so much value to the Father. Jesus looked at them, and Jesus is looking at you, and he's saying, listen, you got to understand, you are salt, meaning you are valuable. You are so valuable. When I look at you, I see great value. One of my favorite verses in all the Bible is 1 John 3, verse 1. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. And that, say it with me, and that is what we... This is important because Jesus says you might be. He didn't say you might be the salt of the earth if. There was nothing like that. He said you could be as long as. No, he didn't say that. He says you are. Like, if you are my followers, then you are, right? You are the salt of the earth, which means you have great value, which means you don't serve, you don't bless the world in order to be loved. You are already loved. You already have value, and from that place, we bless and salt the earth. When they heard salt, they thought of value. The second thing they thought of is what many of us probably thought of, which is flavor. Flavor. How many of you put salt on your food? Show of hands. Okay, most people are honest today. How many of you would say, this is church, this is a safe place, how many of you would say you have a little bit of a salt issue, right? And so you're like, I'm really glad I came to church today. It's a little bit of an issue. You've tried the patch and that hasn't helped. You're doing all kinds of stuff. You don't put like a little salt, like you cover it in salt. And so here's the thing that we all, I think, would agree on. Salt adds some flavor, right? I happen to love French fries. My favorite French fries are Portillo's. French fries, anyone else? I'll get emotional if I talk about it very long. But the French fries from Portillo's are so good. But I'm telling you, I would not eat their French fries if there was no salt. Why is that? Salt just does something when it comes to flavor. This metaphor, how you and I are the salt of the earth, is so powerful. Jesus is saying, listen, you're the flavor of the city. You're meant to be the flavor of the workplace. You're meant to be the flavor of that team and of that dorm room. You're meant to be the flavor of that home, of that apartment complex. You are meant to be the flavor. In fact, so much so that your neighbors or teammates or coworkers or colleagues could not imagine if you were not there. It would be the equivalent of imagining Portillo's fries without salt. We can't even picture it. We can't even imagine it. Jesus is saying, listen, you're the salt of the earth. To the degree that you would salt everything that you come in contact with, you are flavor. Every room you walk into, you bring the flavor. Every conversation, you add the flavor. One of the stories that comes to mind that we watch every Christmas is one of the greatest movies of all time called It's a Wonderful Life. How many of us love that movie? And we do. And I'm now like second generation. I get the kids around. They don't understand most of it, but that's okay. We watch this movie. It's so amazing. And in it is the story. Anyone know his name? His name is George Bailey. And there he is. Oh, I love George Bailey. And next time you watch that movie, I want you to think about it from this vantage point. Now, George, he was the salt of Bedford Falls. And if you remember, Clarence, this kind of deal happened where George was removed from Bedford Falls. And as the story continues, you see what Bedford Falls would have been without the life of George Bailey. Things weren't as they should be. Things fell apart. Relationships weren't formed. Injustices prevailed. Why? George Bailey was removed. And at the end of it, George Bailey is back in the story. Why? Things are changed because he was the salt of his city. He was the salt of Bedford Falls. And in the same way, you and I are meant to be the salt of our city. One of my favorite proverbs is Proverbs 11, verse 10. When the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. Every day I read a proverb and a psalm, and I write about it in my, this is me writing, I type. I write about it in my journal. And this came up just a number of days ago, and it just really struck me. I want you to think about it. When the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. So many of you are and have prospered. The question is, has the city rejoiced? Let me ask it this way. This question has kind of bothered me, so I want to bother you with it. Who has your prospering benefited? And are they related to you? Okay, so oftentimes our prospering, it definitely, we call them like our beneficiaries. I think that's the official term, because they're related to us. And so oftentimes our prospering, it benefits those that live with us, which is a really good thing. All right, that's a really good thing. But from Proverbs, and we see lived out in the life of Jesus, and in this moment saying you're the salt of the earth, he's saying, listen, you're supposed to be the salt of the city. You're supposed to add this kind of flavor. Has your prospering benefited those around you that may not be related to you? When the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. My and me is not the end of Christianity. The third thing that they thought of when they heard salt was that of healing, Show of hands, how many of you thought of healing when you heard of salt today? Anyone think of healing? All right, a few of us thought of healing. That's because we've been very sore. I used to be involved in a terrible thing called marathon running. It's a form of, punishing yourself. And so I used to do this. I used to run a lot. And after I'd be done running a lot, I'd kind of be like limping around the kitchen and stuff like this. And then what I would oftentimes do is I would take a bath, but I would add what? Salt. Yeah, good old-fashioned hot salt bath. In fact, I was talking to Tommy about this, and he takes a salt bath every night. It's because he's almost 40, not because he runs. He does not run. But he takes a salt bath every night because he's an old man. And so, why do people take salt baths? It's because salt heals. It heals. Earlier, I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday, early in the morning, Hannah, my daughter, came downstairs, and we were having our morning snuggle time. And I'm going to do this as long as they'll let me. And so we're snuggling, and I said, hey, I want to talk to you about my sermon for this coming weekend. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. She's like, oh, that's cool. I'm like, I know, it's amazing. So I started talking about, like, here's what this means. And so when I get to the healing part, I said, here's what's interesting, Hannah. I said, there's this really bizarre verse in the book of Isaiah that says, after childbirth, you need to salt your babies. She's like, what? I'm like, I know, there's weird stuff in the Bible. I said, we need to understand context, all right? Because if you're literal in that standpoint, I said, Hannah, we would have salted you in the delivery room. I said, we didn't do that. We didn't pour salt all over you in the delivery room. I said, but this is why they said this in the book of Isaiah, because way back in the day, when that baby would come out of the womb, it could have a scratch, it could have a cut, there could be an infection. And so way back in the day, salt was a healing agent, and so they would cover their babies in salt. And Hannah was really glad that things have progressed since the ancient of days. But we talked about that, and then I went to this place, and I said, okay, so that's what it means. It means that you, Hannah, are a healing agent in the world. I said, Hannah, here's what you got to understand. When there are wounds in this world, Christians are meant to fill them. We are meant to pour our very lives into the wounds of this world. Christianity is not a faith that stands back with indifference. We engage. We fight for our city. We move towards the broken. We move towards the wounded. We pour our very lives into the wounds of this world. And as a church, we have a strategy for this. We want to launch you into a missional community. I'm part of one. Our focus is to serve single moms in crisis in Carroll Stream, kind of in our area. We have a strategy for you. It's a 4-step thing. It's called our growth track. I can talk to you about it after service. We have a strategy for you to literally become this kind of healing agent with others. And here's what's important to remember is when Jesus says you are the salt of the earth, the you is not singular, it's plural. And what Jesus is getting at there, he said, listen, this is not a solo sport, but the way that you and I are salt, a healing agent to the world around us, is when we go as a family of missionary servants, not as individuals, but when we go with one another, that's when we make a significant difference. We need to pour our lives into the wounds of this world. It was 3 years ago, I got home from work, and my wife, Kelly, she greeted me with a question. She said, hey, you know, we became a safe family, this awesome organization, and they just called, and they asked if we would take in into our home a little 2.5-year-old girl. So that's how I got into my kitchen. I'm like, oh, yeah, my day's been good too. How's your day been? And so she said, oh, what do you think? And it just in an instant, for whatever reason, I had this peace come over me that the answer was like, we need to do this. And so I said, let's involve our daughters. Let's ask them what they think. This is their home too. And so we got our girls involved and we said, hey, you know, we're a safe family. And what that means is we respond to families in crisis. And we take in these little kids. And there's this placement, this 2.5, 3-year-old girl. What do you girls think? And they were so excited about it. They're like, we have to do this. We have more room than we need. We have to take in this little girl. And so we did. Some of you remember her. Her name was Ashley. And so she lived with us for 5 months. I thought it was going to be like a week placement. It was a 5-month placement. And the problem with that is my heart just got completely stolen by this little one. I mean, absolutely stolen. And so after the 5 months, she was able to get reconnected with her mom. Such an amazing story. God has been at work in that family in an incredible way. But we've stayed in touch. We've continued to talk and to, in many ways, be the salt of the earth for this one family. And to the degree that just recently we were able to get them into Jubilee Village in Carroll Stream in our town. So now they live like 3 miles from us. It's an incredible thing. And like every few weekends, the mom works, which means we get to take Ashley back into our home, which is so awesome. And so this morning, when you guys were still really tired and you were chugging coffee to try to wake up, here's what I was doing. I was having snuggle time with this little one named Ashley. And it was amazing. She came down the stairs and she calls me daddy boy. That's for another day. I just roll with it. And she just kind of like does this, and I'm used to seeing like my biological children come down the stairs, but this morning was different. Here she comes down. She just kind of reaches for me, and I swoop her up, and I'm there having coffee, snuggling with her, and I'm just talking to her about Jesus. And for me, I don't know about you, but for me, it's in those moments, I'm like, this is why God has placed me on this earth. It's in that moment I feel like I am so connected and partnered with Jesus. I'm doing his work. I am being the salt of the earth. And there's a lot of ways I need to be that I'm not yet, but in that moment and in this morning, Jesus was saying that this is what it can look like for you to be the salt, the healing agent in this world. This past week, I wrote these words about what it means for us to be salty Christians. And I want to read this to you. This community that Jesus was speaking to in Matthew 5, they went on to actually become the very salt of their city. And so let me just read this to you. Who do you think created the first hospitals in the ancient world? Who were the first to adopt dying babies in the ancient world? Who were the first to defend the rights of women in the ancient world? When Romans threw out the disease-ridden into the streets, like the evening trash, guess who picked them up and took them in? The answer to all those questions are salty Christians. This is your history. If you profess to be a Christian, this is where we come from. The salty don't sit idly by while the world bleeds. They love as Jesus loved. They serve as Jesus served. They launch themselves like Christ into the mess, into the darkness. When gaps are created by sin, salty Christians fill them. When the marginalized are mistreated, salty Christians defend them. When wounds are created by evil, salty Christians mend them. The salty don't shrink back, they engage. The salty don't run from the fight, they run to the fight. You are not the salt of some other earth, you are the salt of this earth, of this city. Can you imagine if we went from the selfie generation to the salty generation? How often you and I are just wrecked with the issues and problems and pain of this world, and we look at our news feed and we push back and we say, God, would you do something? And oftentimes you need to hear him saying, I did, I created you and I created the church. We are and will always be plan A to restore what is broken in the world around us. And today is certainly a day, I think, where we can experience that with Project Just Start Sunday, but today is just a day. And Jesus called you to more than a day, one day of the year. If you serve with the Holiday Gift Mart, 2 days of the year. That team serves all year, to be clear. But he has called you to more than 2 events of the year. He has literally called you the salt of the earth. 365 days out of the year, 7 days a week, would we be the salt of the earth? They thought about healing. The fourth and final thing they thought about certainly was preservation. In the first century, electricity did not exist. Therefore, refrigerators did not exist. And it's hard for us to think about life without our appliances, certainly our refrigerators. But back in the day, they did not have refrigerators. So how did they preserve things? Answer, salt. It was salt. When we started Mission Church, when there was hardly anyone part of this church, we asked a really important question. We asked, what would it look like for us to join Jesus to be this preservative in the 10? In fact, we said, what if, and what would it look like for 5 years from now for our community to say, man, we can't imagine if Mission wasn't here. And so rewind the clock, 8 years ago, these are the questions we were asking. What would it look like for us to be salty Christians? And what that led us to was an opportunity at one school in Hanover Highlands. I was there and I was starting a little mentoring program with some others in our church, and the principal and I became friends. And I asked him a question. I said, what do you need? And he said, man, it's a great question. He said, here's actually what we need. We need backpacks. We need backpacks. And I said, okay, how many do you guys need? He said 30. And I said, all right, we're going to follow through on that. We're going to provide 30 fully equipped, fully loaded backpacks for your school. And so I talked to our church. At that time, there wasn't many of us, and we doubled, and we did 60. And we were so pumped. We're like, this is amazing. We did 60 backpacks, and we brought those to the school. And he's like, well, this is more than we need. I'm going to talk to Ann Fox, and those 30 went to Ann Fox. And so year one, we were able to provide 60 backpacks at 2 schools. The second year, it went to 11 schools, and I think 508 backpacks, not that I remember things like this. And then the third year, it just kept increasing. And then we asked this question, what would it look like for us to eradicate the entire need of elementary age kids in the 10 that need backpacks and school supplies. We said, hey, here's the deal as a church. We can't alleviate every single issue in the 10, but there are some that we can, and I think this is one of them. And so we did some homework, and we ended up finding out that there were right around, at that time, 3,000. Now it's dropped down to 2,500, but here's what's incredible for you to hear, especially if you're new to our church. For 4 years straight, there is not one elementary age kid in the 10 that needs a backpack. It's an incredible thing. And we have now backpacks in every single elementary school in the 10. That's 50. And this year, there's a need at 47. And so I want you to think about that backpack in front of you is not going to just stay here at our church. No, it's going to be filled up by you here in a few minutes, and it's going to be delivered into an elementary school right here in the 10. Why would we do this? Why would you give faithfully to this church, and why would us, as those accountable to God on how we steward the resources of this church, why would we invest so much money, in fact, $70,000 to do this? Why would we do that? Well, we just believe that Jesus was serious when he said, you are the salt of the earth. You're the salt of the earth. And so I want to pray for us. I want to pray for you. And when I'm done, Dan Ruda is going to come up. Dan is now in charge of all this, and his staff under him to execute Project Just Start. They've been working all week. A bunch of you have volunteered all week. But I'm not very good at details. So Dan's going to come up, and he's going to explain how we're going to do this. So let me pray, and then Dan, you can take it from there. God, thank you for the vision that you gave them and that you have given us. And God, I know that we've done quite a bit in the past 7.5 years, and I just know that we're not done. And God, I pray for us as a church that we would be known as a salty church. And that us as people in our own neighborhoods, on our own streets, workplaces, we'd be known as salty Christians. God, I'm asking for you to move today in a powerful way, that today would not be the end, but in many ways the beginning of living this kind of Christianity that Jesus, you lived out to perfection. That mine, me is not the end of Christianity. But God, that we would have a love that doesn't terminate on itself, but continues to expand to touch more and more people, that we would be the salt of our city. And we ask this, Jesus, in your name. Amen.